Be sure to check out my second channel called Rob Explains. There you can check out videos where I explain things outside of comic books. Throughout the 1920s, Dell Publications served as the industry standard on print media. Led by a syndicated series of newspaper strips called Famous Funnies, these publications were the go-to source for comedy, satire, and adventure. But a new age was emerging, one which would force Dell Publications out of the limelight as a competitor emerged with a flagship character that would change print media forever. While the Superman that we know today with the red cape and the blue uniform did not appear until Action Comics issue number 1 in 1938, the origins of Superman can be traced back to his creation at the hands of Joe Shuster in 1933 as a telepathic villain bent on world domination. During this same year, Joe Shuster would introduce his creation to a fellow classmate at Glenville High School in Cleveland, Ohio, named Jerry Siegel, who would go on to publish Superman in his own series titled Science Fiction: The Advanced Guard of Future Civilization. By the following year, as the two worked together, Jerry Siegel would revamp the character, going through a series of drafts, which would ultimately lead to Superman's publication with Action Comics issue number 1 and his establishment of the superhero archetype.
And to fill you in a little on the beginning of it all, one night, as has been mentioned in past stories, ideas kept coming to me, and I kept getting up again and again during the night and just jotting down these ideas and these scripts. Until very early the next morning, I dashed over to Joe's house, which is about 10 blocks away. I showed him the script of Superman, the entirely new concept in which there would be a meek, mild-mannered reporter, Clark Kent, Lois Lane, who scorned him, but who flipped over Superman, not knowing that Superman and Clark Kent were one and the same person. Now, you want to stay? You want to stay with your reaction?
Well, I was very, very excited about the whole idea. I just took on the same enthusiasm. I thought it was a terrific idea, and we went right to work right then and there.
You sat down at the drawing board, and you began designing the way the characters would look.
Yeah, we spent the entire day working on it, all afternoon, and we at the drawing board. Jerry and I, and
now I remember that the matter of the costuming of Superman came up, and I remember two suggestions I made to you. One, that the letter S be on his chest.
Right,
as
I wanted to give
symbol.
him a skin-tight costume to show up his physique, for one thing, and then Jerry suggested putting on a cape. A cape,
so that when the character zoomed through the air, would give more action and movement to the character.
Make it look like he's really flying. Yeah. And very, very
and of
colorful.
course, you added all those additional things like the boots and the belt and the and the whatever.
I wanted to make it as simple as possible.
In the eyes of Siegel and Shuster, the 1930s were a time of social unrest and economic turmoil for the United States. It had been 4 years since the onset of the Great Depression, and while things were taking a turn for the better, for many people, the effects were still being felt. Suicides, robberies, homelessness, and a general sense of scarcity were still a part of American life. And with the possibility of a Second World War looming in the background, society needed something to look up to, something to inspire them with hope, even if only for a short time. To this end, Siegel and Shuster modeled this newest version of Superman after 3 important characters that represented the strength and resiliency of the human spirit. The first was Hugo Danner, of the famed novel Gladiator, written by Philip Wiley in 1930. The result of an experiment at the hands of his father, Hugo Danner was born with incredible strength, but told to keep his powers hidden, as society's inability to understand him would make him a target of fear and ignorance. The second was Hercules, the Roman name used for Heracles, the famed son of Zeus and Alcmene, who imbued the very essence of courage, strength, and ingenuity. And finally, the third inspiration for Superman came in the form of Samson, a man of biblical origin who received incredible strength from God. And so with their newest creation in hand, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster spent the next 6 years trying to find a publisher, trying to find someone who would take this newest character, this Superman, and bring him to the mainstream. It was during this time that Superman was introduced to Consolidated Publishing, and the hope here was that Consolidated Publishing, which had previously released a series called Detective Dan, Secret Operative issue number 48, would pave the way for the comic book industry, and by extension, allow Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster to print their creation. But Consolidated Publishing had only made one story of Detective Dan, and had no intention of moving forward with the series. And so while they had sent an encouraging letter to Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster praising their work, with Educational Comics, United Feature Syndicate, and now Consolidated Publishing all rejecting their idea, Shuster became fed up and destroyed all of the pages of Superman with the exception of the cover, which was saved from a fire by Jerry Siegel. And so as Siegel and Schuster recovered from their disappointment and continued their efforts to find someone willing to publish their story of Superman, another comic book icon was emerging, a Tennessee native and writer with a penchant for creating short stories who would develop what many consider to be the very first comic book.
I'm Nikki Wheeler-Nicholson, and my grandfather was Major Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson, and he is important because he was the first person to use all original art and scripts for comic books. So he started really the first comic books with original art and scripts. He also hired Siegel and Schuster. He was the first publisher to see the Superman drawings. He hired Bob Kane. He hired Walt Kelly. Basically, a lot of the industry standards in comic books are as a result of my grandfather. He began his career in the pulps writing adventure stories, and that's one of the reasons that the titles of the comic books are called adventure, action, detective comics, because they come right out of the pulp stories.
A former member of the United States Cavalry, in 1934, Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson launched National Allied Publications. Intending to capitalize on the popularity of the famous Funnies comic strips, Nicholson found that Dell Publications was unwilling to take a risk on his newly established company due to fear that his work wouldn't sell. Refusing to be left out of the fledgling market, Nicholson made history for the first time by launching his own comic book in the form of New Fun Comics #1. Deviating away from the reprinted material found in Famous Funnies, New Fun Comics #1 contained a series of comedic stories involving characters designed by Nicholson himself. However, because the concept was new and money was slow, Nicholson made history a second time by being the first company to offer advertising in its comic book publications in order to offset the cost of production. While Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson would go on to launch Adventure Comics as a second publication, he also discovered that because Famous Funnies was selling so well as it contained characters that the general public was already familiar with, distributors were hesitant to invest in his content because it had never been tested before. In their eyes, Famous Funnies had an established market, and Dell Publications had proven itself capable of providing content that customers would purchase. And so with money running out fast and virtually all doors being closed in his face, Nicholson found himself in a partnership with a man named Harry Donenfeld. As the owner and operator of Independent News, while Harry Donenfeld had occasionally dipped his toe in magazine markets, Independent News largely operated as a distributor as well. Seeing this as his chance to ensure the existence of New Fun Comics and Adventure Comics, as well as introduce his third publication in the form of Detective Comics, Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson sacrificed a large majority of the rights to his work in order to allow Harry Donenfeld to provide distribution. With Nicholson and Donenfeld working together and forming a joint company called Detective Comics Incorporated under the umbrella of National Allied Publications, the two began to hire on various writers and artists in an effort to introduce new ideas, and among the creators hired on as part of the Detective Comics Incorporated branch were Siegel and Schuster. While their early work in Detective Comics consisted of stories like Slam Bradley, a private detective with brains and brawn who, for all intents and purposes, was a spiritual predecessor to Batman, Siegel and Schuster also saw this as an opportunity to attempt to introduce Superman. Unfortunately, because of the rapid growth of Detective Comics Incorporated and with the company receiving numerous concepts written or drawn by other aspiring creators, Siegel and Schuster's Superman was quite literally thrown into a pile and completely ignored. While the two continued their work with Slam Bradley, among other creations, Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson's decision to engage in business with Harry Donenfeld would come back to haunt him. In the summer of 1938, Donenfeld sent Nicholson on a vacation for the purpose of brainstorming and creating new ideas for the company. During Nicholson's vacation, however, Harry Donenfeld filed a lawsuit against Nicholson for non-payment, and because Nicholson's vacation made it impossible for him to appear in court, Donenfeld won the lawsuit by default judgment. As a result, Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson was forced out of Detective Comics Incorporated, and Harry Donenfeld retained all rights to National Allied Publications and its properties, including Detective Comics Incorporated, as well as all of the work produced by Nicholson himself. And so with Nicholson out of the picture and Donenfeld in control of Detective Comics Incorporated, while he continued publication and distribution for New Fun Comics, Adventure Comics, and Detective Comics, he also sought to expand the lineup of existing stories, launching a fourth series in the form of Action Comics. With short on material that could be provided to meet the deadline for the launch date, Donenfeld instructed Action Comics editor Vince Sullivan to find content that could quickly be added to issue #1. Sorting through a stack of write-ins, Vince Sullivan stumbled upon Superman, and as a result, not only was he added to the roster of stories, but printed on the front cover. Originally depicted as a child sent away from a dying world by an unnamed scientist, The newborn was discovered by two passing motorists who took him to a local orphanage. While there, he demonstrated incredible strength, and as the years passed, he was able to leap 1/8 of a mile, raise tremendous weights, and run faster than an express train, all due to his advanced physiology and the fact that his race was endowed with incredible strength once they reached maturity. With the name Clark Kent operating as a disguise, Superman served to fight on behalf of the common man. Within the pages of Action Comics issue number 1, Siegel and Schuster also developed Superman's main love interest in the form of Lois Lane, a tough-as-nails journalist whose name is actually a derivative of Lola Lane, one of 3 sisters that performed as a 1930s singing act. Considered by many to be the first lady of comics and the quintessential damsel in distress, in truth, the development of her character was influenced by 3 individuals. Physically, Lois Lane was designed to look like Joanne Carter, the future wife of Jerry Siegel, who started her modeling career after posing for a series of drawings by Siegel while he was working on the concept for Lois Lane. In terms of personality, Siegel and Schuster used the fictional character of Torchy Blaine, a no-nonsense reporter who did what it took to get the story and was played by Glenda Farrell in a series of 1930s films, as well as Elizabeth Cochran Seaman, the famed photojournalist who traveled around the world in 72 days. For Siegel and Schuster, Lois Lane existing as both a reporter and a love interest of Superman was a combination that inspired elation, suspense, and comedy among fans. Working directly with Clark Kent, the banter between the two was a hallmark of their friendship, and as a love interest of Superman, Lois served to ground his character and make him more human despite his alien origins. But as a reporter, fans always wondered if she would ever learn that Clark Kent and Superman were one and the same. However, following the release of Action Comics number 1, Harry Donenfeld considered both the character of Superman and the concept to be ridiculous, and while he had intended for Superman to be removed from publication and effectively locked away, his mind was changed when, as the legend goes, he approached a young boy at a comic stand, and when he asked why the young man was buying Action Comics issue number 1, the boy replied, "Because it's the one that has Superman." With sales of Action Comics cementing that Superman was here to stay, the golden age of comics had begun, and the comic book industry was off to the races. Selling the rights to their creation for $130 in a contract to supply material, by 1939, the success of Superman saw Siegel and Schuster collaborating with the introduction of a solo series titled Superman number 1, which ran alongside Action Comics, but differed in that the stories of his solo series focused largely on Superman himself, instead of including supporting characters like Lois Lane, which were frequently seen in Action Comics. During this same year, the Man of Steel received his own radio show program titled The Adventures of Superman, and by 1941, the world was met with Superman's first animated film created by Fleischer Studios, the now infamous, although defunct animation studio, based out of New York City. Not all was perfect for DC's newest creation though. While Superman's success saw the introduction of heroes like Batman, the standout star of Detective Comics, and a rival that would remain one of Superman's closest competitors in both sales and popularity, the golden age of comics also saw the introduction of characters similar to Superman, the closest of which was a hero named Captain Marvel. The 1939 brainchild of writer Bill Parker and artist C.C. Beck, Captain Marvel's popularity rivaled Superman in that while the Man of Steel was the first superhero, Captain Marvel had something Superman didn't: a child with superpowers. With comic books becoming increasingly popular among young boys, the allure of Superman came in the form of imagination and the possibility that his readers could live vicariously through his comics and right the wrongs of their own lives using the Man of Steel's fantastic powers. Capitalizing on this sentiment, Fawcett Comics, a division of Fawcett Publications looking to cash in on the rise of superheroes, introduced Captain Marvel as a young homeless boy named Billy Batson, who was led to a wizard named Shazam. Recognizing the financial struggles of Billy Batson, as well as the courage he displayed in the face of such hardship, the wizard bestowed Billy with the power to become a superhero by shouting the word Shazam. Because Captain Marvel provided fans with the belief that a child could become equal to Superman, the sales of Captain Marvel soared and even led to a radio show that predated Superman's. And so, recognizing the success of Captain Marvel and that his character appeared to be a carbon copy of Superman, DC filed a lawsuit on the grounds of copyright infringement, a case which would go on to remain in court for over 10 years. By the time the 1940s came around, Superman was cemented as a mainstay in pop culture, but at the time, his stories largely consisted of 1 or 2 issue battles between himself and a gangster or some small-time villain. In the minds of Siegel and Schuster, in order for their creation to have longevity outside of this initial comic boom, Superman needed a nemesis, an arch-villain, that would return constantly to face him. However, because Superman's abilities were largely physical, with strength, speed, and power, his nemesis needed to be the other half of the equation and possess a level of intelligence that would test the Man of Steel and push him to both his moral and mental limits. To this end, Siegel and Schuster introduced Lex Luthor in the pages of Action Comics issue number 23 as a megalomaniac bent on world domination. In his first appearance, Luthor had amassed an army by way of mind control and was in the midst of pitting two unnamed European countries against one another when Lois Lane stumbled upon his plan. Sending a note off to Superman through a soldier who was unaffected by Lex Luthor's devices, Lois Lane was eventually rescued and Lex Luthor was defeated. Testing the waters a second time, Lex Luthor returned in Superman issue number 4 in 1940, but Siegel and Schuster also used this as a way to establish Superman's moral limits in addition to his wits. With Lex Luthor challenging Superman to a series of tests regarding his strength, speed, and durability, at the conclusion, Superman threatened to throw Luthor into his own plane, cracking his skull in the process. While Luthor admitted defeat, this situation went towards the darker nature of Superman during the Golden Age, and that he was willing to kill, and in the case where someone willingly threatened his life or the life of someone around him, expressed little remorse over their deaths. However, as time passed, Joe Shuster's eyesight began to deteriorate, but because Superman's popularity was at a fever pitch, leading to appearances in World's Finest and other DC publications, Schuster was unable to keep up with the increased workload. In response, he launched his own studio, which hired on artists such as Jack Burnley, Fred Ray, Wayne Boring, and Al Plastino, all of whom would become known as some of the most iconic artists for the Superman title. During this time, however, the world was changing. Germany had already invaded Poland, and World War II was underway. With the United States remaining neutral for both political and social reasons, Superman's comics during the early days of World War II maintained his role as fighting criminals and corrupt politicians, as well as saving the day. But after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, leading to a declaration of war by the United States, Superman, like nearly all comic book superheroes, reflected this, and that his story saw a shift from fighting on American soil to fighting overseas. While the Superman publications never officially used terms like Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini, the propaganda within his comic books was clear. Superman supports the Allied troops, and so should you. And so by 1945, at the close of World War II, following the surrender of Japan aboard the USS Missouri, as the most popular title DC had at the time, the Superman comics began to shift their focus back to the United States. With Dick Grayson introduced as Robin in 1940 and serving as a driving force behind Batman's popularity among children, DC looked to incorporate this element into the Superman mythos as a way to expand on his character and increase sales. And so in this same year, under the writing and artistry of Siegel and Schuster, DC officially launched Superboy. Appearing for the first time in More Fun Comics issue number 101, because of Superman's popularity, Superboy was an immediate hit among fans. Introducing concepts like Superman's hometown of Smallville, Superboy provided fans with the evolution of Superman and filled the gap between his arrival on Earth and his undertaking of the Superman mantle. This combined with Superman issue number 53 in 1948 retelling his origin story by introducing Jor-El as Superman's father meant that during a time when the popularity of superheroes was on the decline following the end of World War II, Superboy was actually gaining popularity, and so by 1949, he received his own solo series, aptly titled Superboy No. 1. During this same year, and after its creation for the Superman radio show in 1943, under William Woolfolk, fans were met with the comic book introduction of Kryptonite. Originally depicted as red in color, its first introduction into the comic books explains that Kryptonite arrived on Earth following Krypton's destruction and served to provide a weakness to Superman, an aspect of his character that made him all the more relatable, which in turn fueled the flames of his popularity. In the eyes of fans, it seemed as though the publications of Superman were nothing short of perfect, a sentiment that would be compounded on during the Silver Age, which would see Superman's origins revisited and answers provided to some of his fans' most burning questions.